Greetings sailors and welcome to Patreon Supporter Spotlight number, the one that comes after 68. I mean, I could say it, but then I'd have to start making jokes about it, and well, I'm not feeling that juvenile today. Other days maybe I would, but not today. We're going to start off with Ischium in The Sims, which is one of the original premiums that was sold before the game even came out of closed beta. And it still holds up pretty well today. The only really notable thing about this that I should mention is that Ischium is using the shorter range, faster torpedoes. And by short range, I do mean short range. It's 5.5 km, which on a tier 7 destroyer isn't that good. I think the only thing that has shorter range torps are the Soviet boats, which I think at tier 7 are still packing 4 km torps. The other option is, of course, the 9.4 ticklers. And I call them ticklers because they don't do a lot of damage and they are extremely slow. I once took a full spread, as in ate every single torpedo of the 9.4 km torps, which I think do a max of like 8,000 damage each. And I can't remember what I was in, but it must have been a battleship. And I ate every single torpedo and survived because they just do so little damage compared to most of the torpedoes. So he doesn't have the range. He's going to have to ambush people if he wants to use torps. But otherwise, it is all round quite a good little ship. And in fact, if you have one of these, it is, as I'm sure you are by now probably well aware, the best destroyer to take into the Dunkirk mission. Although the Monahan's not bad either. If you take the A-hull Monahan, which has 4 guns as opposed to, of course, the second hull having 2, that is, with the defensive AA consumable, still pretty good. It actually beats the Farragut. Anyway, that's got nothing to do with this, though. This is a regular game, of course, as you can see. And so far, well, he's successfully gotten that Igler to back off, and now he can cap. And he's also got a fair few allies nearby as well, which is a good thing because so far this is the only cap where this team is particularly mustering any amount of force. The rest of the team, roughly half the team, is spread fairly far back from B and C, apart from what looks like 2 of the team's others destroyers who are poking around the C cap, but they don't really seem to be successfully being able to contest it, and so at this point they're backing off. So they've gotten the A cap, the enemy has gotten the B cap, and although there are some enemies still around here, they are themselves trying to back off a bit at this point. Apart from this Britannia, who just seems to be sailing forwards regardless of the fact that they are heavily outnumbered in a bottom tier battleship. It's not really the best idea. Maybe they just want the pain to be over with. I don't know, although personally I think it's not totally terrible, although it's not great, especially when it's down tiered. That and the New York are probably the weakest of the tier 5 battleships at the moment. I'd have to comb through the stats to determine which precisely is the weakest, but in terms of their general firepower and damage output, they're probably not too far from each other. In fact, the Britannia actually has smaller guns. It's like 13.5 versus the 14-inch guns of the New York, but they probably aren't any more accurate particularly. So as they're just ploughing forwards, this affords Ischium a perfect opportunity to make a ambush drop. And because these are the shorter range, much faster torpedoes, the Britannia has a very low chance of actually dodging. And of course they don't even know he's here. They know he's around somewhere on this flank, but they don't know he's precisely here. And so, although the island eats a couple of them, there's still 6 headed their way, and they're not really going to be able to react in time. If it was the 49 knot torpedoes, they probably would have time to dodge out of the way, but as it is, his damage control is apparently on cooldown, and so he actually gets that last little bit of damage through flooding. So that's a nice kill, and that also opens the way to start being maybe a little more aggressive towards the B cap. Although there's still some enemy ships poking around this side. They haven't totally given up on A. I'm not sure why the Igla's trying that, to be honest. They don't have anybody particularly to spot for them, apart from maybe the Graf Spee. Although, having said that, then the Akatsuki spots up right there, so actually it turns out they do have somebody to spot for them, but it's still quite a bold move, all things considered. Now, as this is a US destroyer, of course, it gets the very fast-firing, very fast-reacting turrets, but they are, as with all of the other US destroyers, at their most effective when in knife fighting range, because of course the arcs make firing at longer ranges rather undesirable. It's fine against slower moving targets, against battleships at longer ranges which can't really readily dodge out of the way that well, but if you're trying to hit a cruiser or a destroyer especially, then you're going to have real problems. So that's one set of torps into the smoke, where we know that Igla still is because they're still firing. But the French smoke isn't hugely long lasting, and as it turns out it's going to be starting to fade towards the time when he's getting here. Although I think the Igla starts to bail out before the smoke is going. You can't really tell without being in the smoke because of course you have to be in the smoke to get the timer, but as it is, the Igla backs out and gets spotted very briefly, and spotted again, and they're low enough health that, well, that's another kill for Ischium. And he still hasn't lost any health at this point. He's sitting on 2 kills, 41k damage, which is not half bad for this ship, and still hasn't taken a scratch, but that isn't going to last. For a while, it looked not great. To begin with, the team situation was a bit iffy, but with them having secured the A cap and firmly anchored down this end of the map, it means they've been able to now make a steady push into B with sufficient numbers to really cause the enemy team problems. And although they have lost some ships themselves, they are outpacing the enemy team quite comfortably in that regard. And so it now looks like it is swinging quite nicely in their favour. They're capping the middle and they are ahead on both points and kills. It could still slide away from them at this point, but they would have to basically be screwing up quite massively. They would have to be giving the game away. At this point, Ischium chooses to do a little bit of a risky thing. I don't know if he was maybe trying to set up for another ambush potentially, but he popped around the island well within detection range of the New Orleans, who wasn't being quite as careless as that battleship earlier, and so he's taken a bit of damage finally and been forced to pop one of his smokes as well. He's not really getting that much of a use out of it in the scheme of things. These guns are... it's more about the rate of fire and trying to set fires against things that aren't destroyers, because of course they are 127mm shells and you only have 4 of them, so it really is the volume of fire more than the quality of fire with these guns. New Orleans is backing off though, and he could chase after them, but I mean the Nuremberg is doing so. They still haven't capped the middle yet. I think this has caught his attention because he's now, instead of trying to pursue the New Orleans and fight a cruiser that's kiting away from him, which is not particularly a desirable position to be in this destroyer. In fact, probably most destroyers. The Khabarovsk could maybe get away with it, but most other destroyers you wouldn't really want to. So yeah, he's going to try heading over to the middle, and as the last surviving destroyer, he might have a pretty good chance of helping speed up finally capping B, because they still haven't managed it yet. They've just been getting reset, apparently. The New Orleans, meanwhile, well, they killed the Nuremberg and they're just running off to the top of the map, so they're basically irrelevant and out of the fight at the moment, although the the Normandy and the Fiji look like they are heading up that way. Otherwise, the closest things to Ischium are this Leander, who he decides to open fire at, and personally I would have just sat and gotten the cap points. He's opening himself up to being reset, and his chances of doing any significant amount of damage were probably not that high. But maybe he figured he's just in with enough allies at the moment that he fancies his chances at not really taking any significant damage. Although we can see it's not the Leander that was aiming at him, it was one of the battleships. Well, the remaining battleship, in fact, the New Mexico. Although there's also a Pensacola down there as well, which is definitely not a battleship. I don't want to have a Jingles moment and call a Pensacola a battleship. It was funny, there were many jokes along that theme from many different sources, including Jingles himself. Once it was announced he's won the ring contest, and people were wondering what his special abilities might be, and yeah, that was a suggestion from many sides, is that the voice lines should just completely not reflect what actual ship you're dealing damage to or spotting or whatever. It should just randomise and say, oh yeah, that's a battleship, when it is in fact a destroyer. And who knows, that might actually be a thing. So it's just mopping up at this stage. There is the potential to do a bit more damage if you get some fires on the New Mexico especially. And as there are now multiple things firing at the New Mex, well, the New Mex could try firing at him, and it could be potentially nasty. That really is just in the hands of RNG. But as the Dallas is also now charging towards the New Mexico, that is almost certainly going to be the more tempting target. So for as long as that Dallas stays alive, Ischium is probably fine just to keep sailing around in open water and pelting the New Mex with shells. Although really he could just as equally smoke up, sit stationary and pelt the New Mexico at this stage. But maybe he felt it would be the nicer thing to do as a teammate of this Dallas, rather than relying on them to spot for him and being the only one being shot at, or there being the possibility of them being the only one shot at. He is at least theoretically making himself available as a target for the New Mex, but of course the New Mex has to choose to shoot at him, so practically speaking I don't think there really would be much of a difference there. That whole sentence, by the way, this is... I've not been doing a lot of videos this week, and well, apparently my brain has just, you know, it's tried to go on holiday early. That's about the level of coherency that I am at the moment, and that I have been for most of this week. So that's New Mex down, and he actually gets the kill there, so that's his third kill, and about 10,000 more damage overall, which is not bad. The teammates who went up north chasing after the New Orleans did finish them off, and so all that's left is the Pensacola, who is probably feeling a little bit persecuted right now. And if this were me, I would pop my speed booster and I would just go all in, and instead Ischium, I mean, he's closing the distance kind of, but he's turning away, he's dropping, and although he might get a hit, he isn't really going for the full-on aggressive charge here. He turns away, he smokes, although he's close enough that he's within spotting range for firing whilst in the smoke. In fact, he's almost within assured spotting range anyway. So the smoke was a bit of a waste at this stage, and it really is just the question of will he survive or not. Although the Pensacola, you know, having taken that torp and being under fire from the Dallas, who managed to survive, well, as it turns out, they ran out of hit points first. So there we go. And as you can see, this was quite an appropriate amount of damage for this particular episode as well. Just make the jokes in your head. Just get it all out of your system. It's fine. I'll just sit here and wait a second. So there we go, top of the team, 1800 XP, but in the Sims, that's not that surprising. It was a decent result. It was a very decent round in the Sims, and it was interesting to see it played with these shorter range torps, because I think I've mostly seen it played with the longer range torps, even just sims that I encounter in the wild tend to be using the 49 knot ticklers. But in this case, no, he was able to use the faster torps to fairly good effect. But yeah, the reason why he was unsurprisingly at the top is because this thing does also get a nice XP modifier as well. So it's a little like the Churchill 3 in World of Tanks. You can have a reasonably okay round and end up on the top of the team just through that nice modifier. So following that, we are with another destroyer game, and this time a tier 9 destroyer game, the Yugumo, which is in some ways more comfortable than the Shima. I sort of prefer the Yugumo to the Shima. The Shima has its place. I've had some decent rounds in the Shimikaze, but the Yugumo is a more comfortable ship. Although then the gap is a lot narrower these days. For a while there, the big thing between them was that the Shima had about a 400 meter worse spotting range, and it's now about 100 meters instead. It's something like 5.4 versus 5.5? Or is the Shima now 5.4 as well? I genuinely can't remember that. But that was one of the big factors anyway. I mean, you had less torpedoes than the Shima, obviously, but just the ability to outspot other destroyers and to have that stealthy Japanese ability was quite a boon, whereas the Shima, not so much. The Shima really relied more on keeping its distance and just hosing down areas with torpedoes and acting almost more as area denial, although you could still do boatloads of damage if you managed to get lucky with your hits. In this case, the first thing he's run into is a Jutland, which he absolutely does not want to get into a gunfight with, but fortunately he's managed to lose no health, and although we know there is a radar ship nearby, and in fact it must be a US radar ship based on the duration of the radar, they aren't actually in a position to fire, so they're clearly just sat behind the island and not actually willing to pop out and engage. We can also definitely posit that there is a destroyer somewhere in the middle as well, one of the enemy destroyers, because that's a whole bunch of torpedoes that just went past and a whole bunch of potential damage that he's racked up without really having to do anything in particular. It's a bit of a stalemate at the moment though, because that Jutland's unlikely to press out, and if he tries to engage the Jutland by getting to where he can spot them, he is going to be in serious trouble. This is Hildebrand, by the way. I should have said that. I don't think I've said that already. But if you've... I mean, I've already said that my brain isn't maybe firing on all cylinders this last week, and so, yeah, it's perhaps not surprising if I'm going to miss minor details like the name of the person that's actually playing the game. Anyway, so he's just sending out random volleys on the principle of you never know when you might get lucky, because very occasionally you do. But in this case, he's not going to with any of these. The Jutland isn't in a position where he can actually manage to hit them with a blind-fired salvo. And he could try and back up to the point where he could, but he knows there's a radar nearby. And of course, the Jutland has got their own hydro as well. It's not so much a concern in terms of spotting Hildebrand, but in terms of them picking up any torps fired in their direction, it's a bit of an issue perhaps. So there's another radar. That's 2 used by whoever it was that's been using them. The only thing that is potentially a threat right now is the Richelieu, the only thing that has a line of fire, but they don't seem to be having a go. But there we go, it's the Salem that was radaring, and perhaps a little disgruntled by the fact that nobody else is bothering to fire at this pesky destroyer that was blocking the cap. They pop into view themselves and to do a bit of damage, but nothing too bad. Although it hurts a bit more in terms of Hildebrand not having survivability expert. He doesn't have those extra hit points to burn. That's always a useful skill on a destroyer, especially so at higher tiers. In fact, I might as well say why exactly. I think that's a thing that it isn't always obvious to people, why survivability expert should really only be taken on destroyers. Wargaming's done a bit in terms of indicating which skills are more useful on which classes, although sometimes there are exceptions for individual ships. But no, there aren't really any other classes where you want to take survivability expert, and it's all down to the percentage, the proportion of extra hit points that you get, which for a destroyer represents quite a big jump, whereas for a battleship or a cruiser it is basically negligible and just a waste of captain points. So instead of trying to contest A, where there are nasty destroyers and things with the radar still around, he decides instead to go and try and retake the sea cap, although we know there are multiple enemy destroyers here. And, well, technically, you know, the Khabarovsk is a destroyer, although it's arguably more of a light cruiser than anything else, but the Kagero definitely is, and there's quite possibly something else as well, although actually no, there won't be. They've lost their other destroyer at this point, so we know where all the main destroyers are. There's two here, and the Jutland in the sea cap. So he plays with his speed a little bit, manages to throw off some shots, and then I think makes a bit of a snap decision to lay down smoke. I'm thinking he was perhaps thinking of, I mean, he used his speed boost, and this is why I'm supposing this. Perhaps thinking of whizzing round north and to the west and just putting some distance between himself and the enemy ships. But instead, now he slams on the brakes, puts down the smoke, and that means he's able to shoot at this Khabarovsk without any real difficulty. But the problem with putting down smoke here, when he knows there are destroyers nearby, is that it's a great big torpedo magnet. I almost said a great big artillery magnet there. That's the wrong game entirely. There's a smoke over there, although that isn't destroyer smoke. There are a pair of Minotaurs on the enemy team. At least I think it's a pair of Minotaurs. Yes, it is a pair of Minotaurs. And so, whilst the torpedo strike does strike lucky, he himself only really just avoids the incoming wave of torps, which was fired at his smokescreen, because smokescreens are big old torp magnets, and I think it would have been wiser to get out of the smokescreen a little sooner than that. But he got a bit lucky in that his ship was oriented in just the right way that he was able to, without too much difficulty, all things considered, squeak round and not have too much of a problem. But now he does have a problem, because he's popped out the smoke, and there's that Kagero, who is very close and backed up by an Izumo. Now the Izumo secondaries aren't too much to worry about, because quite frankly they are rubbish, but the Kagero might be a problem. And of course it's not like the Izumo just has secondaries, they've got their main battery as well. Now this definitely looks dicey. He's managed to land a big hit into the Kagero, in fact manages to kill the Kagero, because the Japanese DD guns, whilst they may not fire particularly quickly, they do hit hard. But despite being taken down to 1,000 hit points himself, it looks like he might get away with this. There's a bit of frantic dodging going on here while he's still spotted by the Izumo. But the Izumo doesn't seem to have been trying particularly hard to kill him here, nor the Montana that's pulling into the middle either. They seem much more focused on the Conqueror that has pushed into A. And there is a Musashi that's backing them up as well. But they're looking maybe like they're in a bit of an awkward position right now. So we might lose some ships there. The Conqueror especially, you know, they've gotten themselves into a position where they're sort of being flanked. Now we've skipped ahead a little bit here because we were just waiting for the reload on the Torps and Hildebrandt setting himself up from the Montana. But meanwhile, whilst the Conqueror did take down the Izumo, they themselves then get killed by the Jutland with their guns, in fact. So the Jutland obviously I don't know if that would have been AP or HE, but either way, the Conqueror was clearly low enough health that that was a viable thing for the Jutland to do. They are starting to take this back, though, in terms of kills anyway. The enemy team is still a little bit ahead on points right now, just because the enemy team held, at one point, all 4 cap circles. Now that wave of torps looks like it was a very good drop, and of course these being Japanese high tier torps, you don't need many hits to really do a lot of damage, and so that Montana afforded him the opportunity to significantly top up the amount of damage he's done. And this game is not untypical really for a Japanese destroyer. The damage output of, well, really any destroyer that relies on its torpedoes is always going to be very spiky. And this game provides a perfect illustration of why. You might land an odd torpedo hit here or there, and then suddenly a broadside battleship gives you several tens of thousands all at once. That smoke screen there, by the way, I heavily suspect that was laid down as a decoy. And of course, having laid down a decoy smoke, he can then pop in and try and cap. And hopefully, there we go, it will attract the torps, which it does. But given that this is blocked, we know the Jutland is here. And so I would be bailing right now. He's got absolutely not enough health to take the Jutland. And the Jutland's concealment is nearly as good as he discovers. I think it's 5.5. And although he gets the drop on the Jutland and gets the kill for the Crackin, and this is why Hilty sent me this, by the way. This was his first ever Crackin game. At least I believe it's his first ever Crackin, if I'm understanding him correctly. It might be his first Crackin in this ship, but I think it was his first Crackin. He then gets finished off himself, but there are only 2 enemy ships remaining. Although the enemy team, you know, they're ahead on points, it's not going to be enough. This is not ahead on points with 30 seconds to spare. This is ahead on points with 6 minutes to spare. As a bonus, he manages to get a torp into the Richelieu and is even getting some flooding damage. But sadly, it's not going to be that much. They clearly had their damage control party just about to come back on cooldown, and so there we go, they've triggered it. But that still tops him out at just over 100,000 damage done. So I've sped up this last part of this replay, or at least I've sped up part of it just because, well, it really is just finishing off these last couple of ships. Their Harugumo, by the way, absolutely no fear, barely any health, decided to go in all guns blazing against the Zhao regardless. That jerkiness, by the way, there does seem to be a bit of a, not a bug, but an issue with the latest client version, where if you're looking at the plane view, or in fact if you're looking at any other ship post-death as well, it is incredibly juddery for some reason. So that was a 100k damage game with a Crackin unleashed. It was a very decent round by anyone's estimation, and with all the kills, with the damage done, he was able to place top of the team. So well done, Hildebrand. That was a very, very decent Yugumo game. It was, dare I say it, maybe even quite good. High praise, I know. So that about wraps up this episode. I will maybe try and do one a bit sooner at around Christmas, maybe a little before Christmas, because this one was frankly quite late, so it wouldn't really be so much the next one being early as me just trying to keep some semblance of a schedule. But anyway, I think I'll try and do something a little bit special. I've got something sort of in mind for the Christmas one, so we'll see if there's enough replays that are suitable to make it happen. Until then, however, well, not until then, until the next video, I hope you've enjoyed this one, and if you have, you can do all the usual things down underneath it. And of course, as always, stay tuned for more.